Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. I'm so glad that you're joining me today. Also joining me today is Lisa Lewis, journalist and author of the book, The Sleep-Deprived Teen, Why Our Teenagers Are So Tired and How Parents and Schools Can Help Them Thrive. This book was described as a call to action by Arianna Huffington, and this book was reviewed by the New York Times and is an outgrowth of Lisa's previous work on the topic, including her role in helping get California's landmark law on healthy school start times passed. So thrilled that Lisa's joining us today.
Millions of kids struggle with learning, processing, and social emotional difficulties. These challenges interfere with their ability to reach their full potential. Dr. Karen Wilson is here to help. Her extensive background in pediatric neuropsychology and higher education have prepared her for this unique mission. Listen as she delivers content to inform, educate, and empower parents and educators. This will enable you to identify challenges that kids face and get them on the road to achieving their full potential. This is Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus.
Hello, Lisa.
Hi there. Thanks so much for having me today.
I am so glad you're here. We have so much to talk about. I've been so excited about this call all day. And, one of the reasons why is that we're talking about something I'm very passionate about. We have talked a great deal on this podcast about the developing brain and differently wired brains. And we've also talked about the importance of sleep. And you talk about the developing brain and sleep in your book, The Sleep-Deprived Teen, which makes me very, very excited.
Yes. Well, and there's so much to know, really. I think there's so much just for parents to understand about what's going on during the teen years in terms of brain development and in terms of sleep.
Absolutely. And, what I find interesting is that when kids are younger, parents are often meticulously attending to their child's sleep habits. They track their kids' sleep. They make sure they're getting naps. And later on, we don't pay as much attention. But you know better than most people that we need to continue paying attention to sleep, even when those children are tweens and teens.
Absolutely. And to be fair, it does get trickier as they get older. There's so much complexity, obviously, with parenting, and that's especially true with our teens because so much continues to change.
Absolutely. And you talk in your book, you say so much. I can't say enough good things about your book, but you talk about this phase of brain development that occurs during adolescence when the brain is pruning, it's sculpting the brain pathways so that the brain just works more efficiently. It actually prepares the brain for adulthood. And you talk about the importance of sleep in that process and just in how sleep is important in general.
Yes, absolutely. So, I'm glad you brought up the brain development piece because adolescence is a major time for brain development, major phase of upgrading that's taking place. As you mentioned, it's two main processes that are going on. The first is pruning, and the second is remodeling. So, basically, what's going on is akin to, when we hear use it or lose it. Well, that's what's going on when it comes to brain cells. So the ones that are being used the most develop the strongest connections between them, and those that aren't being used get pruned away. So, and this is because there is a surplus of brain cells that were created during the initial phase of when the brain was first created. But pruning away that excess helps the remaining brain cells function more efficiently. And this is what's going on during the adolescent years and primarily when they're sleeping. So I think that's especially important to know. And then that second piece, the remodeling phase, has to do with strengthening the connections between those brain cells so that the end result is faster processing. In fact, one of the neuroscientists that I interviewed for the book compared the process to upgrading from a dirt road to a paved freeway, just to give a sense of the dramatic improvements. But this is taking place over the course of adolescence. It's a multi-year process. In fact, it even stretches into the early 20s. So such an important phase going on for such a number of years. But when it's finally complete, It means that our teens and young adults are able to focus their attention more effectively, to behave less impulsively, and to be able to make better decisions.
Absolutely. And it seems that sleep is important for that process specifically.
Absolutely, yes. So as I had mentioned, the pruning primarily taking place when they're asleep. Now, sleep itself, when you think about it, we're asleep for about a third of our lives. So obviously it's a pretty important time, and there's so much that's going on when we're asleep. Has to do with processing and sorting through all the information we've taken in over the course of the day. I should back up and say I'm not a medical expert. Sleep is a very complex topic, but just some of the broad highlights I think are important for your listeners to understand. It's when we're sorting through all this information. It's important for emotional regulation. It's important for appetite regulation. It's important for growth. That's when growth hormone is primarily released. And so that's, of course, essential for growth. As our kids are growing, growth hormone is also important for healing from injuries. So all this is taking place during sleep. And for our teens, the number of hours that they need of sleep is actually greater than what we need for adults because they're still growing, they're still developing. So up until age 18, they should be getting 8 to 10 hours of sleep a night. Those are the official recommendations for optimal functioning and well-being.
And I think a lot of parents are surprised with those numbers.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Because you hear 8 hours like it's the magic number, right? And 8 hours is great for us as adults. Our range of recommended hours is 7 to 9 hours. So 8, that's great, right in the middle. But that's the minimum for our teens, and more specifically, 14 to 17-year-olds. Our younger teens and our tweens actually need even more sleep than that. For our teens, up until age 18, they should be getting 8 to 10 hours every single night. But that's 14 to 17-year-olds. Our younger teens, up until they hit 14, actually need more sleep than that. They should be getting 9 to 11 hours of sleep every single night.
And I've done evaluations on a number of kids. And when I ask about sleep, most parents don't know how much sleep they're getting, or they underestimate how much sleep their kids are getting.
Absolutely. And it gets harder, to be fair. As our kids get older, our teens, they close the door. You don't often know exactly what time lights are out. It does get harder. They're naturally on a later sleep schedule anyway, which, they are going to start going to bed later as they get older. And that's another really important thing I think for listeners to understand is that that's based on biology. There's a circadian rhythm shift that takes place when our kids hit the teen years, meaning that their entire sleep schedule shifts later. So they are going to not feel sleepy as early as they used to. They're also not going to feel ready to wake up as early in the morning as they used to. And that's not because they're lazy. It's not because they're stubborn. It's because of biology, as I mentioned. Specifically, melatonin, which is the hormone that primes us to start feeling sleepy, is no longer released as early in the evening as it used to be. So for our teens, they're not feeling sleepy until about 11 o'clock at night. And then, of course, we know many of them aren't getting to bed even at 11. And the melatonin also does not subside until later in the morning compared to when it used to. So they're not feeling ready or able to wake naturally as early as they used to.
So there are so many factors playing a role here. And, one of the things that you highlight in your book is that, teens aren't getting enough sleep. And I think that is something that we all know. I think we are a sleep-deprived nation. So it's not just the teens, but it's everyone. But you did a lot of research for your book. Why, can you give us some of the reasons why teens are not getting enough sleep?
Yeah, so there are a number of factors. There isn't any one, overarching factor. However, there are a few that are sort of the primary ones that factor into this. I should back up a little bit and tell you about my story of how I sort of got involved in this, because my involvement has to do with one of the factors, which is start times, what time our schools start in the morning. So that is the biggest policy change that can be made is moving middle and high school start times to 8:30 or later. So that's the recommendation from the American Academy of Pediatrics because of the impact that these early start times have on the amount of sleep teens are able to get, and then based on all the ramifications when our teens are sleep deprived. So that's actually what got me into this issue in the first place. So I'm in California, and at the time my oldest was starting high school, our local high school began the day at 7:30 in the morning. That was first period, regular. This was not zero period or optional. So I got propelled into this issue when he started ninth grade. This was 2015, so I've been immersed in this for the last 8 years. But to give you sort of the quick summary, I, as a parent, was seeing the impact of this. As a parenting journalist, I wanted to look into it further, and so I did start researching the issue. Quickly found out, there was a body of research recommending that schools start at 8:30 or later. That this was not unique to our community. And so I started writing about this. One of the articles that I wrote was an op-ed that ran in the Los Angeles Times in 2016. And it just so happened to be read by one of our California state senators you couldn't script this, right? But, he actually read this in the newspaper. He, at that time, had a high schooler of his own. So it's an issue that resonated with him. He decided to look into the issue and ended up introducing a bill on the topic. And I got swept up in that whole journey. I ended up testifying about this in Sacramento. Long journey because it was 2.5 years from the time the bill got introduced to the time that it actually got signed into law. Then it took another 3 years. But that law finally went into effect summer of 2022. So this is only the second school year that has been in effect. And California was the first state in the entire country to set a law that sets minimum allowed start times. So that was how I got immersed in this whole issue, looking at start times, but more broadly, teen sleep. And then that's what ended up leading to me writing my book, The Sleep-Deprived Teen. So start times, definitely a big part of this. There are also other issues when you think about the other end, which is what time they're going to bed. And so the two that I would highlight there that are usually playing the biggest role in that is tech use, as we mentioned, because tech is just omnipresent in our kids' lives. And often if they are on tech too late, that can have various implications, which, we can talk a little bit more about. But the other that I also think is super important to highlight is the issue of overscheduling. Because so often our kids, can just be on overload. And with everything they have going on, it makes it super hard for them to get to bed at a reasonable hour. And again, keeping in mind, they're supposed to be getting 8 to 10 hours of sleep every single night.
Absolutely. And there's so many factors there that you're talking about. And, you started with the start times, and the research shows that those schools that delayed start times for school, there are better outcomes for those students.
Oh, absolutely.
In terms of academic performance, in terms of social emotional well-being. And that is such an important thing, particularly when you think about the other point that you made about circadian rhythms changing for kids, for teens specifically, and how they're going to sleep later. And so if they're going to sleep later and then having to wake up at 6 a.m. to get to a 7:30 class, obviously that is going to have a negative impact on their sleep.
Absolutely. And, when you have kids who literally are falling asleep in class, and I talked to, teachers about this, that was not an uncommon occurrence for teachers who were teaching that first period class. They talked about the challenge of needing to really be on, that it wasn't just about needing to teach them, but needing to keep them awake, because that's true. If you're literally asleep, obviously you're not learning, but even if you're there, your eyes are open, but you're not really fully awake, that is impacting the ability to learn. So this is interesting because it's not just while you're learning the information. There's actually 3 different ways. So it is during that time frame when you're acquiring the new information, so when you're sitting in class or you're trying to learn it on your own, but then when you're sleep deprived, it also affects the ability to retain that information, because that whole process of synthesizing and storing and assessing all the information happens during sleep. But then the other piece that's affected is the ability to retrieve the information. So you're trying to remember what you learned in school so that you can do your homework that night. You're trying to remember what you studied when it comes time to take a test. So absolutely, when you are sleep deprived, it is impeding the ability to learn. And there's also sort of a point of diminishing returns. I mean, if you think about, I don't know about you, but I can vividly remember times when I'd be so exhausted. I'd be sitting there trying to read the same material, and you realize you've been stuck on the same page and read it 10 times and nothing is absorbing.
I've had that experience. I've absolutely had that experience. And I think one of the things that you say in your book, and I say as well, is that we all function worse when we're sleep deprived. In terms of alertness, attention, you talked about learning and memory, academic performance, because again, like you were saying, students just don't learn well when they're sleep deprived. And it also impacts emotional regulation. If you think about being irritable, right? Making poor decisions, poor impulse control, all of those things are impacted by how much sleep we're getting.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's not just our teens, it's for us too as adults. We are more emotional. It's harder to regulate your emotions. You feel things more intensely when you haven't gotten enough sleep. That is absolutely true. But it's even harder, actually, when you think about it, for our teens, because as adults, we do have a fully mature prefrontal cortex that helps sort of dampen that increased emotional response that comes from being sleep deprived. Our teens, they have a prefrontal cortex. It's functioning, but it has not fully matured because they're still in the midst of the brain development. So that piece to help as a counterbalance isn't really acting in full force the way it is for us as adults. So yeah, they're more emotional. It also, when you think about mental health issues, my goodness, when you're sleep deprived, it exacerbates anxiety, depression, even suicidality.
Yes. Absolutely. And I think you had even noted in your book some of the research about when teens get enough sleep or get adequate sleep, it actually reduces their risk of suicidal behaviors.
Yes, there is a dose-response relationship where they have shown that for every hour, well, there have been a number of studies, but essentially the more sleep deprived you are, the higher your risk of suicide is. And the converse is also true, that when you get more sleep, it decreases the risk. So, and part of that also ties back to impulsivity, because the barrier for impulsive behaviors is lower when you're sleep deprived. And of course, there is an unfortunate connection between impulsive behaviors when you're talking about something like suicide.
And adolescence is already a vulnerable time for mental health issues. So then you add sleep deprivation on top of adolescence and an underdeveloped brain, and then it can be disastrous.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I have some of the data here. It came out earlier this year. This was from the CDC, from the 2021 Youth Risk Behavior Survey, which what they found was that more than 29% of high schoolers said that their mental health was poor either most of the time or always during the past 30 days.
Goodness.
I know. Our kids have had so much going on these last few years. It really has been a very difficult time. And then when you layer in sleep deprivation on top of what they're already facing, it really, really exacerbates things.
Yes. So it's mental health, it's academic performance, and it's also safety when you talk about suicide, but also even our athletes. I'm thinking about gymnasts who are doing these complicated routines. If they're sleep deprived, it puts them at greater risk for injury. Sleep impacts recovery. And you talk about driving, our teens who are driving in your book, and what that means when students are driving while sleepy.
Yes. Well, we think about it. Our teens are already the riskiest drivers out there on the road because they're new drivers. They don't yet have the judgment that comes with those years of experience. And then you layer in sleep deprivation on top of it. And unfortunately, drowsy driving crashes for teens, that's a real issue. And teens are, they don't have the experience that more seasoned drivers do. They also sometimes are engaging in risky behaviors like texting while driving. And again, you layer in sleep deprivation on top of that. You think about, particularly for those teens who go to really early starting schools, they're out there on the roads, likely haven't gotten enough sleep, and maybe it's also dark. I mean, this is just not a good combination.
Not at all. So the burning question here is, how do we help teens get more sleep? Obviously, talking about delaying start times for school is critically important. It sounds like parents who may not have that adoption of an 8:30 sleep time or later, advocacy is needed. But what are some other things that parents can do to help teens get more sleep, or we as a society?
Yeah, absolutely. So start times, I do personally think that the kind of law that California passed, and which Florida has recently passed too, by the way, although it's not going to go into effect until 2026, but addressing start times ultimately at the statewide level, to me, does feel like a very important step, because otherwise it ends up happening community by community, which has happened in many locations, but really on a patchwork basis. So ultimately, yes, I think, when you talk about broader as a society, I think that really is something that should ideally be in place everywhere. Because we've got schools right now starting as early as 7 a.m. I did an interview for a station in Nashville. Their schools right now start at 7:05. Yeah, so that really, really is an important piece of it, because obviously if you're going to school that early, that makes it practically impossible to get enough sleep. But to your question about what else can parents be doing, there actually are a number of things, because then you start focusing on, well, what can I do looking at what time my teen is getting to bed at night? So the first issue there really is looking at whether they are overscheduled, which is, so easy to sort of end up in that situation. I know as a parent myself, with everything that our teens have going on, between not just the hours they're in school, but also everything else. So the recommendation would be to really sit down and try and take a look at how much of their time is already allocated for all these other things that their commitments that they've already signed up for. So it's the hours that they're in school. It's also how many estimated hours of homework per night per class. And especially if they're taking advanced or honors level classes, that's going to likely be a heavier homework load. And then look at all the other things they're involved in, others after school activities. Are they in drama or band or speech and debate? Are they in activities outside of school, like club sports? Do they have a job? All of those are hours that are already taken up during the course of any 24-hour period. So if you add all that up, and keeping in mind, of course, they need a little time to be able to eat meals and, sit down, take a breath. But see if there's even enough time left. Is there at least 8 to 10 hours left to give them the opportunity to be able to get enough sleep? Because if you add everything up and you see that there's not, that is a red flag of that's contributing to why they're not able to get enough sleep, and you may want to reevaluate. So that's a tricky thing, obviously, with, having to pick and choose, well, which things should stay in the schedule, which things shouldn't, but recognizing that sleep should stay in the schedule, that, if you're doing all this and sleep is getting short shrift, there are real implications as we've been talking about. So that's the first one. The second piece is looking at tech use, which is, it's a huge topic, as you know. I mean, tech has permeated all of our lives, right? And I have a whole chapter on this in the book because it's complicated. It isn't that tech is bad. Obviously it's here to stay. It's how our kids do their homework. It's an integral part of their social lives. It's how they are in contact with their friends. The same way, when I was in high school, I'd be on the telephone for hours. Well, they're not talking on the telephone, but they are, using their phones to, Snapchat or whatever they're doing to stay in touch. But that's that's valid. That is part of how they stay connected. The issue, though, is the amount of time, that our teens are spending online. And if it ends up impacting sleep, which actually really there's three ways that can be happening. So the first is simply the time displacement aspect. So if you are online or you're playing video games till 2 a.m, yes, you're cutting into your sleep. Those are hours you could have been in bed asleep. So that's the first aspect. The second, though, is that what they're doing online is often stimulating and engaging. So it's not, calming if you're playing a video game. It's not calming if you're engaged in a really emotional back and forth with your best friend about something that's going on, a relationship issue, etc. That's not helping them wind down and get ready to go to bed. And then the third aspect is blue light. So, these backlit devices emit blue light, and that actually primes us to feel more alert. And so when you have that impact of that blue light later at night, that can end up delaying when melatonin is released, which of course then delays when they're feeling sleepy and therefore able to fall asleep.
And I feel like we can't talk about sleep without talking about technology, which is probably why you devoted, a good amount of time in your book to it. Because I think I just heard this morning that 1 in 3 kids is on their device between midnight and 5 a.m.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. I hadn't seen that statistic, but that's such a great point, is that it's not just being on tech up until lights out, it's being on tech afterwards. And there was a study I had seen a little while back. I think it was Canadian college students, and it was the number who, when they woke up in the middle of the night, got back on their phones. So that actually leads to, so what can parents do? Well, there are best practices actually for tech use. One of which is removing the devices from the bedroom at night. So ideally your phone isn't there right on your nightstand. It's being charged in a central location like the kitchen. So that is a best practice, American Academy of Pediatrics. Second one, they recommend getting off the devices at least an hour before bedtime. So again, that's harder sometimes to put in practice, than it is to just convey the information. I totally recognize that as a parent, but I think it's still important to know that's the best practice. That is something perhaps to work toward. So disengaging from tech, not like being online, being in productive mode or, involved in all these chats with friends up until the minute you turn off the light. That's not going to, help you drift off to sleep. So those would be some big ones. I would say also, in place of that time that you're on your device, ideally you're encouraging your teen to disconnect. During that time, instead, to be doing some sort of a wind down routine. So really focusing on something that's going to help them relax and kind of make that transition to being able to drift off to sleep. So, it's like what we did when our kids were younger and we had a bedtime routine for them, reading a book and snuggling and all that. So, there was that dedicated transition time. And that's still such an important concept, that transition time. And so having it be reading a book, ideally like a print book, not on a Kindle, just because of the blue light potential aspects, taking a bath, doing yoga, coloring, listening to a podcast even. So, you don't have the visual aspects there, but something that works for them, that helps them wind down and helping them or encouraging them to kind of identify what are those activities and to kind of build in this practice of having a set, series of, wind down steps that they do to help them go to bed.
And it seems like if you are a parent whose teen sleeps with their phone underneath their pillow, right, who has it in their room, who is on their device right up until bedtime, that making changes in the home, it really has to be collaborative in terms of its approach.
Yes, absolutely. I'm so glad you brought that up because, especially as our teens get older, coming in and just sort of announcing a new household rule is not generally going to be a super successful approach, especially as our teens get older. If you've had tech rules in place from the time they're young, absolutely, that's going to make it easier. But if you haven't, it's not too late. but it does end up being definitely collaborative, as you mentioned. It's probably, ongoing conversations. It's encouraging your teens to have input into the process. So letting them know the best practice. If they're sleeping with their phone under the pillow, that is not a good idea. There's no need for that, obviously, because at a minimum, they should have notifications turned off. There's no need for them to have their phone within, a fingertips reach at every moment of the day. If they're using it for an alarm clock, well, you can get an alarm clock. You don't have to use your phone for that. But I think it's sort of getting them involved in the conversation of what do they see as, the aspects that may be most impacting them, ideally getting them to try some solutions themselves. Things like, at a minimum, turning off the notifications, as I mentioned, but moving the phone, even if it's in the room, doesn't have to be right next to the bed, and then seeing how that worked. So, getting them to perhaps identify what are the things that they see as issues, what are some of the, things they think might work, having them try it, see what works. But then the other key piece, as part of this being a collaborative process, is for us as parents to be good role models. So something like charging devices in a central location, that's not just their phones then, that's our phones too. So, having a wind down routine. If they see that we are intentional about that and we take sleep seriously, that's helping be a good role model. And really, the biggest, overall message is making sleep a family priority.
Mm-hmm. I love that. Lisa, you beautifully outline a number of strategies for success, ways parents, teens, schools can address the sleep deprivation issue that we have. And really, when you do that, you help more kids thrive in this world. And I'm going to be sure to put a link to your book in the show notes. Is there also a way for listeners to connect with you?
Yes. So I have a website. I use my middle initial because Lisa Lewis is somewhat common. So it's lisalewis.com. That's my website. And then my book, The Sleep-Deprived Teen, I've got info on my website about the book. It's also available, all the various online places that books are sold or at local booksellers as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lisa, for writing this book, for sharing it with the world, and for being here today. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you for having me. Really, really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much for listening, and be sure to pick up a copy of Lisa's book. If you need more resources and support as you manage your journey parenting a child who learns and thinks differently, be sure to check out childnexus.com. We have information, consultations, and mini courses available to you. Thanks so much for listening, and enjoy your day.
Thanks for listening to Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus. For more resources, visit us online at childnexus.com.